Well, I want to welcome you all again this morning. Glad that you're here. I recognize that there's a lot of things you could be doing, including nothing. We're real grateful that you're here. You know, the past week, Lindsay and I, we love to watch documentaries. Love them. Most of them are not about happy things, but whatever. Love documentaries. We watched one this past week, a short series called Dancing with the Devil, the 7M TikTok cult. If you haven't seen that one, it's a wild ride. And it's about a religious cult that took advantage of, it dives into this group. They latched on to these social media dancers that kind of blew up. If you remember in 2019, 2020, there was just, social media was plastered with these people just making up random dances or whatever. And so, this cult used these kids and co-opted their all of the influence that they had, all the viewers and all the money that was coming in. And these dancers, they built this massive following online, and then it was co-opted, and they were trapped in this dark place, in this system that was kind of keeping them underneath the leadership of this crazy cult leader dude. But it got me thinking, because at this point, if we're being honest, if you were to ask a classroom full of third graders, fourth graders, what they want to be when they grow up, I bet I would not be surprised if a majority of them said an influencer, a social media influencer, a YouTuber, a streamer, somebody like that. It got me thinking how often that we chase validation, maybe not in those ways, but in small ways. Maybe not dancing and going viral on TikTok, but maybe in subtle ways that you and I craft an image. Ways that you and I craft how we look and appear online and at work or in our relationships. There's this constant pull that you and I often have to perform, to make sure people notice us and that they approve us, that they, even better, that they praise us. And honestly, it's exhausting. And I think we all probably feel this tension, whether you're trying to keep up appearances on social media or seeking recognition at work or just trying to make sure that people see how together that your life appears. There's this pressure that you and I all have. And again, it's sort of like last week where the cultural waters, it's what we're swimming in. And so at times, we're not even aware to the degree it's affecting us. The problem is, it never feels like enough, does it? Even when we get the validation that we so often seek, it fades even more quickly. And here's the tension. Deep down, we know this is not how life is supposed to be lived. And so, we know there's something hollow and something fleeting about chasing the applause of others, but we don't always know how to get off of that treadmill. We don't always know how to get out of those waters because they're the ones in which everyone else is swimming in. We don't know how to live for something or someone in a way that truly satisfies us. And so that's the question we need to wrestle with today. How do we stop living for the approval of others and start living for what truly matters? How do we break free from all of the noise and the pressure and the constant need to be seen? And this ties into our series in an interesting way. Now, I've been talking the last couple weeks about punk rock, and by now you guys have figured out that your pastor's a little weird. That's fine. If you didn't know that yet, I guess you're new here. Welcome to Anchor Church. So glad that you're here. Just stick around and you're going to find out I have all sorts of weird, quirky interests. Mushrooms, punk rock, shall we continue? Like 3D printing. Anyway, the point is, we've been doing this series. The theme's been punk rock. Now, what's interesting about punk rock is when I say that, and if you think of somebody who's into punk rock, you probably don't think of a dude in their mid-40s, right? Like showing up to concerts, but that's what it is nowadays. But I bet you think of somebody wearing like a leather jacket with band patches, spiked hair, and dog collars. Like you think of somebody who's trying to grab attention. And here's the interesting thing about punk rock. When it came onto the scene, that was actually the point. In a culture that was very homogenous, and there were these rules of this is what it looks like, this is what you should be going after, this is what you should do. Their way of being rebellious was to demand attention. And so they began wearing clothes that made them look like outcasts. They were matching what was going on inside of them. And I would put forward that in today's world and where we are right now, we live in a culture where everyone's demanding that kind of attention, where everyone's trying to appear unique and different. Everyone's wanting to be noticed. And everyone's shouting, "Look at me, look at me." And so, what would be the real act of rebellion today in a world or in a culture where everyone's demanding eyes to be on them? I would say that living a quiet life and silence is the new rebellion. Living a quiet life, refusing to demand attention, choosing humility and authenticity and faithfulness over applause and recognition. In a world that's obsessed with being seen by many and approved by them, we see Jesus and Paul inviting you and I to live for an audience of one. In our world right now, that's about the most non-conforming punk rock thing that you could ever do. You see, the first thing we need to understand when it comes to the way of Jesus is that righteousness, right living, holy living, living in a way that brings fulfillment and flourishing, that kind of living, that kind of righteousness, it happens in secret. Have you ever done something kind and thoughtful, and if you're honest, you're just wondering, did anybody see that? Will anybody notice I did the right thing? I picked up the garbage that was not my garbage? Maybe an act of generosity or a word of encouragement, or you did something above and beyond at work, and you secretly hope in the back of your mind that someone would say, "Wow, you are amazing." I've been there. I've been there. I've been in those places, and I've felt that tension between wanting to do good, and at the same time, I wouldn't mind if someone else noticed it. It's very true at home, right? Sometimes you're like, I took out the garbage. Like, well, that's kind of the thing that we do every day. But it's like, well, I didn't want to do it, and I still did it. This is what Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 through 4 says. Jesus teaching Sermon on the Mount. I think he sees that we struggle with this, and this is what he said. "Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you and me, when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Jesus begins this teaching by saying to be careful. Why? Because the temptation is to turn righteousness into performance. And it's subtle. And it's pervasive. The word hypocrite there, actually the Greek word, it refers to the plays and the theater of the Greeks. The idea of this word hypocrite, it comes from a mask, putting on a mask in order to put on an appearance. Jesus uses this term to describe people who have put on a religion. They're doing these religious acts, and it's a mask just to cover who they really are. It's to put on a show. It's seeking the applause of the people who will see this show rather than for God. And in this culture, in Jesus' time, public almsgiving was a way of giving honor. It wasn't really, it wasn't only an act of compassion. It wasn't, they were moved with compassion and empathy and gave. No. There was an idea that when you gave alms to the poor, you did it publicly to gain honor among the people around you. It was about showing how generous and pious you were. Does that sound at all familiar to you? In our world that lives with these highlight reels and stories and passive humble brags about what we're doing and where we're going and how we're serving, whether it's a perfectly curated post about volunteering or sharing how you donated to a cause, or so often it's very easy to share some story that you identify with, and at the same time you want everybody to know that you believe this virtue as well. Jesus flips this cultural norm on its head. And he says that righteousness isn't about being seen by others. It's about being seen by God. Jesus invites us to live for an audience of one when he says, don't let your left hand know your right hand is doing. He's calling us to such a level of humility that even we don't dwell on our good deeds. Do you see what he's doing? He's addressing not only the action but our hearts. When he says to not let the left know what the right doing, he's saying, don't you even meditate. Don't you spend time congratulating yourself. But rather do this knowing that you've pleased God. Psychologists describe something similar. Self-determination theory, they found that people who are motivated by intrinsic rewards, like the satisfaction of doing good and doing right, they experience greater fulfillment than those who go after and chase external rewards like recognition and applause. In fact, constantly seeking that sort of validation leads to burnout and a phenomenon called the hedonic treadmill. But basically, it just means that you start an endless cycle that never ends. That this praise that you get from others only lasts for a moment, and you must continue on the treadmill. And that's why it's exhausting and busy and chaotic. But it doesn't satisfy. Throughout history, we've seen examples of people living this out and choosing to live another way. I think of the Desert Fathers. They left everything behind, all of their possessions, everything, to live a life of humility and prayer. They sought no recognition, and yet their quiet faith actually inspired many others and began the whole monastic traditions that then shaped the church and the world for centuries after. Or there's a billionaire named Chuck Feeney who gave away his fortune in secret over decades. And once he said this, he said, it's fun to give money away when you don't have to see your name on buildings. That's turning it up on its head, isn't it? He understood that there was a freedom in giving for the right reasons, not for the applause or the joy of others seeing you. What does this mean for you and I? Well, I think at the very start, I think it has to start with you and I questioning our motives and asking ourselves, the next time we're tempted to broadcast our deeds or our accomplishment, am I doing this for God? For others? Or is it just for me? Do I need this? And that's a tough question. I think God's calling you and I to find ways of practicing our righteousness in secret. Doing the right thing when no one is watching, that's called integrity. Serving others and doing it quietly. Helping people and not feeling the need to tell another person. Jesus' teaching here invites us into the freedom of humility and secrecy and calling us to align our hearts with God the Father rather than just seeking the fleeting applause of others. But it raises a question. What does this kind of life look like in practice? How do we live quietly in a world that seems to be obsessed with noise? How do we live in a world where we are surrounded by those who are performing and seeking attention and leave us feeling like we are missing out if we are not also a part of it? Paul picks up this idea in 1 Thessalonians. This is actually one of my favorite verses, and when I see Christians doing dumb things, like when it gets on the news, like the national news, or you see these posts going viral, this is a passage that always comes to mind. It's 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 11 and 12. I really wish more people would read this verse and take it to heart. I'm telling you. This is what Paul says. Aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we've directed you, so that you may behave properly toward outsiders and be dependent on no one. I want to unpack what this means. This Paul's calls to a quiet life. And by the way, if I didn't say it, never mind. This is Paul calling us to a quiet life. His instructions to these people is not about like retreating into silence or passivity. Instead, he's calling people to live peacefully and responsibly and humbly. And the context of this in which he's writing, I think, is pretty helpful. You see, some in this church and the Thessalonian church had become obsessed with the end times. I guess that's not new. Obsessed with the end times, they were so convinced that his return was imminent, and so they stopped working, which I kind of get. In the sense that, I've always hoped that, Jesus would return before I had to pay back all my student loans. I get it. But you can't live like that, and Paul's here to tell them, hey, we don't know when he's coming back. You need to start working. He's like, you just can't stay at home and let the rest of the church care for you. And at the same time, the way they were behaving was hurting their witness to those outside of the church. And so, in this message, I think, is what we need to hear today. This message is this: that you and I, in a world of endless distractions and social media arguments and attention-seeking behavior, the idea of a quiet life is pretty radical and it's almost rebellious. But this is what Paul tells his church. He says, work with your hands. Now that's a small detail, but listen, in the Greco-Roman world, manual labor, working in your hands, even today, it's not something that's necessarily glorified, it's looked down upon. But what he's saying is, how you live your life and how you work is a way of worshiping God in the ordinary. That how you are carrying yourself in your life matters to those who are around you. Paul is elevating this, and he's reframing work as being this honorable thing, this glorifying act. And what he's also trying to do, he's trying to say that you and I need to seek to live a life that isn't trying to grab more and more attention, because it doesn't give us what we want, and when it comes to helping others see what it means to follow Jesus, it fails that as well. That's what Paul's saying. He's saying a quiet life is a witness to others. To live quietly and responsibly. He says this, when you do that, this is what he says. He says it wins the respect of outsiders. In other words, our everyday lives are a testimony of the gospel. And people notice it. They notice our integrity. They notice when we show up consistently. They notice when we show up and we work faithfully and we care for others without fanfare. Sociologists call this idea, it's the concept of social trust. When communities see individuals living ethically and responsibly, trust grows, and others are drawn to those values. And this is what Paul envisions for the church. He understands they're living in a culture that does not like them and does not want them, does not trust them. And in that sort of culture, it doesn't make sense for Christians to go grab the bullhorn and start shouting their virtues about how they've got their ethics right and everyone else is wrong. It's not effective for the church in his time to begin drawing lines in the sand and making issues into culture wars and trying to make sure everybody knows that you're on the right side of things. If that was effective, Paul probably would have said that. He probably would have said, hey, have you guys ever thought about doing a tech startup? Make 7-second videos you can share with each other. And then you don't have to go out anymore. He doesn't. Friends, I know we're real smart, and I know we have a lot of technology. How different are we from them right now? We live in a culture that doesn't trust us. We live in a culture where the only time they hear about Christians is when our ethics and morals have failed. And where we communicate one thing, people's general understanding of the Bible is pretty weak. Their understanding of Jesus just as weak. But they know enough. They know enough to say what I'm seeing coming out of the mouths and what I'm seeing posted on social media, what I'm seeing from my uncle or my grandma on Facebook, that doesn't necessarily, I don't think that's what Jesus would say. You see, we are just like the church in Thessalonica. We are just like the church Paul was speaking to, and we need to hear the same message. Our goal should be to live quiet lives of integrity, of faithfulness and righteousness. And we should let that quiet life speak instead of speaking for ourselves. I'm reminded of Fred Rogers. I'm yet to meet somebody who didn't like Mr. Rogers. And everybody knows Mr. Rogers as a pastor, which is why maybe I love him even more, because I get real excited when people like pastors. I've met a few people who don't. And so it's really cool. It's amazing when you think about it. Here is a Presbyterian pastor who's now known all over the world. Why? Why? Because he was chiming in at every world event or every headline. He was throwing his opinion out there into the cultural sphere. Was this what he was doing? Sharing story after story, building a following? Was Fred Rogers an influencer? No. He lived a quiet, faithful life of integrity, doing what God called him to do, treating the people the way God would have us treat them. He lived a quiet life, and his impact is still felt today. What does this look like for us? I think you and I are being called to focus on faithfulness in the ordinary. Faithfulness in the ordinary. Ask yourself, am I living with integrity in my work, in my relationships, in my daily life? The second thing is this. Maybe for us, we need to start resisting the temptation to meddle in other people's affairs. Isn't that what a lot of social media is? It's just being busy, caring about what other people think and throwing your 2 cents in. And then it causes somebody else to throw their 2 cents in. And then next thing you know, you've lost hours of your life. Paul's phrase here, mind your own business, it's not about isolation, but it's about taking responsibility for our lives, being mindful of how we communicate, and choosing to mind our own business. Choosing to live our lives for an audience of one. Choosing to live and to glorify God in all we do without the need to draw attention to it. To live our lives for God's glory, believing that it will have an eternal significance. Paul's vision of a quiet, faithful life invites us to reflect Christ in the everyday. But how do we do this? How is that possible? How do we avoid the pride that so easily creeps into our lives just when we think we're getting it right. This is the end of this message, this last point. I probably have talked about this maybe a half dozen times this year, but I just got to tell you, it's the foundation of the Christian life. And that's why I keep bringing it up. It matters so much. I just don't even know how you can follow Jesus without it. And it comes down to this: humility. Because humility inspires more than hype. I mean, when was the last time you bragged about something? Maybe it wasn't a full-blown boast. Maybe it was the humble brag. That was one thing that probably, I told you I've been preaching out of things that maybe I've been thinking about for a long time, I've never spoken about. One of my biggest pet peeves is pastor humble bragging. I've had some experiences in the past where, every time something went right for a pastor, he was sharing it on social media, and he was like giving God praise, but when you read it, you're like, it feels like a lot more about you than God. God, I just want to thank you so much that I planned this great youth night, and we had over 200 kids show up, and then I preached an amazing message. Lord, thank you that I'm so creative. And, it was like that. We even brag in our prayers to God. That is how delusional we are with ourselves. Proverbs 27:2 says this: let another praise you, not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. And James 4:10 says this: humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. You see, Proverbs calls us to let others, if we do something praiseworthy, we can't stop other people from saying it. Let them be the ones. You don't need to brag. You don't need to draw attention to yourself. People are watching. And if you have done something praiseworthy, they'll say it. And then James just reminds us that we must humble ourselves. He says, God draws near to God. There's grace for the humble, but God opposes the proud. We have to live lives of humility before God. And being humble doesn't mean lowering yourself. It doesn't mean self-deprecation. It doesn't mean having a negative view of yourself. So hear me out. And I understand that sometimes you and I, if we're being honest, some of us are posting on our social media, we're doing this thing because we don't feel good about ourselves. And we want to. We don't feel like we should be bragging, but at the same time, we want somebody to look at us and say, I approve of you. I like you. I think you're funny. I think you're smart. I think you're doing a great job. But God's challenging us here. That the validation that you and I are truly seeking actually can only come from one person. Because all the other people in this world, eventually we realize they're just like us, and their opinion only matters about as much as ours do, and it just doesn't feel fulfilling. James reinforces this idea that we need to be humble before God, to trust God that in His timing, He will lift you up. In His timing, you will be seen. In His timing, you will be recognized. And it will not be cheap. It will not be skin deep. It won't be for just the mask you put on, but God will recognize and lift you up because of who you are to Him. There's freedom in humility. It doesn't diminish us. In fact, it just plays it. It helps us. It's good for us. You realize that there's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a tendency for overconfident people to overestimate their abilities. Have you noticed this? Have you ever had somebody who is quick to jump in to help and say, I can do that, and they can't? They can't. Maybe you're that person. I can do that. What they found is this. The studies have shown that humble people are better learners, they're better leaders, they have healthier and better relationships. Again, our good man Fred Rogers, he was beloved not because he sought attention, but because he quietly consistently showed kindness and care. He wasn't flashy, loud, but humble at every turn. How do we live this out? How do we take everything I'm saying right now? How do we live this out? Because I'm telling you, it would be so easy. It'd be so easy for me to have a message up here today and say, hey, silence is the new rebellion. We should stop posting on our social medias and looking to it for validation. Let us pray and go out. And you could agree with it all, but change nothing in your life. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm with you. I like sharing stories. I like trying to be funny. I like sharing my music with people so that they know I'm still cool at 44. Because I am. And I have great taste in music. Humbly speaking. This is a real struggle for me. And so I want to end this morning. I want to invite somebody up who I kind of look up to. Somebody who I've seen put this into practice and actually live it out in a truly countercultural way, even though she hates punk rock. And so I just want to invite my wife, Lindsay, to come up and just share her heart on this particular topic, because I know she's led the way.
I have not led the way on this, and I will humbly say I haven't arrived in this, but I can say that I probably would not have come to know Jesus if there weren't people who lived this out. I grew up in the 90s in a church where everything was loud and people shared things, and it was so distasteful for me, and it was such a distraction to me that I chose to walk away. And it wasn't for a couple of people that I looked to in my life that I saw they're doing this a little bit different and they're quieter. And something about me, a lot of you guys know, is I'm a quiet person by nature. I don't like a lot of noise. I find it really kind of gross when people are constantly posting about themselves. And it actually angers me, and I can get a little feisty about it, I'm going to be honest with you. But this is something near to my heart for another reason, because I'm a quieter person. This is something that I feel like the Lord is continually teaching me. And one of those reasons is because I feel like I'm the type of person that I can be very disciplined, and I can work anybody out of a room. And that's not a brag. That's just how I am wired. I am wired to be a worker, but I am wired in a background way. I am not an up here kind of person. And for some reason, God just has continually put me in positions in the background, and yet I have felt over time nobody sees the work. Hey, we have this idea, we feel like God wants us to start a church. It was really hard. It was really hard to build credibility with people, right? In anything, these things take time. And so I get frustrated sometimes. And in my job, in the jobs that I've had, I've often been a worker. And it's I'm not going to tell people the work I'm doing, but I'm worried it's not being seen. Not worried, but it's frustrating when it's not seen. Maybe you felt that way before. And it's easy to take those things and our accolades and say, I'm going to post about it. I'm going to tell people what I've achieved. And that's really cheap, you guys. It's so cheap. And so here's what's kind of cool, is over time that I found, when I feel like I haven't been noticed for the work that I've done or the things that I've accomplished, by the time that I actually am, I actually don't care. Because God's actually changed my heart in such a way that I say, I'm not the reason for it. And I'm not up here bragging about it. I just tend to be a quiet person. And so I'm not antisocial. I just really love my quiet time. And I just really feel like at such a time as this, when everything is so loud, I just want to encourage you to just take some time. A practice I put into play no phone on Sunday. And that's not like I'm not going to talk to my mom, and that's not like I'm not going to text you back. That means I am not on a social media on a Sunday. And that's just something I put into practice, but like it's a little weird sometimes because you just tend to take out your phone. It is so freeing. Maybe some of you guys already do that. Some of you guys are so good at this already. So I'm not an expert by any means. But I can tell you this. We should be living humble lives quietly because that's what we're called to do. And I can tell you that in all of the jobs that I've worked, and I've used this approach, people naturally come up to me over time, slow roll, and they ask questions. And ever since I've come to know Jesus, in every single job that I've held, people do that. And I'm not sharing about Jesus just, saying his name. They ask me questions. And I know a lot of you have similar experiences. So that's kind of all I got to say, because, I'm a quiet person.
You're being so nice. I was hoping you'd rip them up.
Steve knows at home I have a little bit of a righteous anger, and I've been actually telling him he needed to preach a message like this, and I often tell him to get off of his phone and to stop posting stuff about what he's done in a humble brag, because it drives me so crazy. And who's to say I haven't done it myself? I have. We all have. But God calls us for more. Calls us to so much more. And if we really live this out in a genuine way, people will come to know. They'll come to know by our fruit. Okay?
Amen. Thank you for that. I wouldn't be at pros if you guys clapped for her. Yeah. She deserves it. Yeah. Well, I wanted to say one last thing. And it's an addendum, and it's ruining the flow of the thing, but I just have to say it. When I was reading, and God just brought it to my mind when I'm over here, so I'm just going to say it. When Paul is talking about living a quiet life and working with our hands, can I be honest with you? If we're working like this with our hands, if we're busy, a lot of us feel real busy. The busyness is kind of just right here, guys. It's right here. I'm so busy, I've spent 3 hours on this. God calls us, like you said, to something so much greater. What we're going to do, we're going to go into communion now. And as we do, I'm going to lead us in our reflection this morning since I'm up here. I just want to invite you. We're going to take just a few moments of silence, of quiet, and then just invite God. What is it, God, that you're challenging me to? Lindsay was right in saying we're not saying this in a judgmental way. We're not saying this like we've got this all figured out. I think, though, it's a clear call from Jesus. I really do. I believe the Spirit of God wants you and I to be intentional and thoughtful and not just go along with just the cultural waves and just to be going with the current, especially with something that seems to so easily rob us of our time and our energy and our integrity and our witness. There's something better out there. Let's take